Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Football Actuary Podcast. I am your host, Brock Talby, the Fantasy Football Actuary. So, week 8 was rough. I'm sure it was rough on a lot of people across all of my leagues. I saw a very down week. Average scoring overall was low. Lots of games were inhibited by really bad weather. Not a lot of boom games outside of a couple players. So overall, averages were down. So if you were down, don't feel bad about it. We will get into our congratulate or commiserate segment of the show. This is where I talk about how I did in my 3 leagues, and then we go to a listener and to hear how they did. And if you won, you can congratulate each other, and if you lost, you can commiserate. This week, you will be commiserating with me because I went 0-3 in my leagues. And let's start off with the most tilt inducing league that I am in this year. It's my 12 team Superflex league. I am second in overall points. It's me and 2 other teams are over 1,000 points right now. We are just crushing everyone else, way ahead of everyone else in points. Those 2 teams are both 6-2. Actually, one of them might be 7-1. One of them 6-2. And then I'm sitting at 2-6 in my matchups. Every single week, I end up playing someone who scores in the top 1, 2, or 3 spot. I've been in the top 4 scorers every week, and I've only won twice in my matchups. And both of those weeks, I was the number 1 overall scorer. So I don't know what else I can do. This past week, I was the 3rd overall scorer. I played the guy who was the number 2 overall scorer. I lost by half a point, and my kicker, Rodrigo Blankenship, missed 2 extra points. So all he had to do was only miss 1 extra point, and I would have won. Or not miss any extra points, and I would have won. Or if Josh Allen had thrown a touchdown instead of not throwing for a touchdown, again, I could have won. So very tilt inducing. All I do is score in the top 4, 3, 2 spot every week. And all I do is lose because my opponent happens to be really high that week. So what can you do? I'm tilted, but we'll keep soldiering on. My other leagues, I was close in my 10-team standard league to winning. I have Josh Allen starting in that league too. So when your quarterback only scores 12 points, it's not a recipe for success. I didn't get enough out of Leonard Fournette and Gronk on Monday night, didn't make the comeback. Yeah, I'm still 4-4 in that league. I'm actually in first in my division. So my division has 3 4-4 teams and then a couple 3-5 teams. So it's close. At least I'm still in the playoffs right now, and I'm actually leading the division. And then my Dynasty League was a week to forget. Yeah, I had James Robinson and Antonio Gibson on bye. Not that good of a week. I had to play Amari Cooper because I have to start 3 wide receivers. Debo was hurt. Chark was on bye. Brian Edwards is also on my roster. He was an option, but he's a hurt rookie. So yeah, I had to play Amari Cooper. I knew it was going to be bad with Ben DiNucci, and it surpassed my expectations. And then in my 3rd wide receiver spot, I played Nelson Aguilar, who had been very good. He scored a touchdown in the last 3 or 4 weeks straight. And then the weather took over. I don't even think he got a target. He scored 0 for me. And then I had to choose between Kirk Cousins or Cam Newton. When you're choosing between those 2 guys, your team's probably not going to do that good. So, rough week for me overall. Good news is I'm still in the playoffs in all 3 of my leagues. So just a few more weeks. I have to keep going. Maybe I can win the division in my 10-team standard. The good news about my 12-team Superflex league is that you get a point for being in the top 6 scores every week, and then a point for winning your matchup. So even though I'm losing all my matchups because my opponents keep having absurd weeks against me, I am getting points every week for being in the top half of the league in scoring. So I'm overall 500 or a little over. So I'm still in the playoffs. Kyle wrote in on Twitter. He shared his Monday night scare. He said he needed Mike Evans to score less than 15 points to win his matchup this week, and Evans luckily stayed just under 15 for Kyle to win by less than 1 point. I'm sure that 4th quarter touchdown had you sweating a little bit. It got a little too close, after that, I'm sure. But congrats on the win and pray for no stat corrections. When you only win a game by less than a point, stat corrections are your worst nightmare. So pray for none of those. And that is congratulate or commiserate. Just a reminder, if you want to be featured on the congratulate or commiserate segment, just tweet at me, write at me, DM me, whatever, on Monday. Let me know how your matchup went that week. I also usually tweet out a question about it. But yeah, just message me and let me know how you did, and you could be featured on the congratulate or commiserate segment. Next, we will move into the high flying or nose diving. This is where I look at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. I talk about somebody who's on the upswing or high flying, and then somebody who I'm starting to worry a little bit about after this week, and they are nose diving or on the decline. So, my high flying quarterback is Philip Rivers. And I want to get out of the way first that he is not a weekly starter, but his last two games have put him in the solid streaming option category. He was QB6 this past week, and 2 weeks ago before his bye, he was QB7. So he has back-to-back 3 touchdown games. He's a great streaming option currently. And in the right matchup, I think he can be a really good bye week fill-in. I am not advocating that you go and blow a bunch of fab on Philip Rivers. I'm not advocating that you put him in your starting lineup on a weekly basis. But I am saying that he is a very good streaming option, and in the right matchup, he can do this. He can get you 3 touchdowns and not torpedo your team. So, Philip Rivers, maybe you have a bad taste in your mouth from years past. He's never been, I don't think he's ever finished as a top 10 fantasy quarterback, which is insane over his whole career. But he has good weeks where he is a top 10, top 5-ish quarterback. So, you could do worse. I think he's a good streaming option going forward. My nose diving quarterback is Josh Allen, which is unfortunate for me because I have him in my 10-team standard and my 12-team superflex. So the first 4 weeks, he was so good, and people are probably going to be locked into starting him without thinking about it because of those weeks. But I think you need to start thinking about it. He hasn't thrown a touchdown for the past 2 weeks in a row, and one of those weeks was against the Jets. His accuracy has looked shaky for the last 4 weeks, so you can't just blame it on the bad weather this past weekend. I know the weather was bad, so you could say, oh, Josh Allen, he had a really bad game because the weather, but he's been shaky the last 4 weeks. I don't know how you go from looking so good and so accurate to regressing all the way back to where he was last year, where people were saying that he's not an accurate quarterback and he'll never be a superstar level franchise quarterback because of his accuracy issues. He came out and proved people wrong to start the season, but since then, it has regressed. I think you can sit Allen in bad matchups going forward. I don't think he's a set it and forget it play anymore. But on the other hand, he has Seattle and Arizona as his next 2 matchups. So Seattle might be the perfect matchup to get him back on track. We'll see. I'm obviously starting Josh Allen against Seattle, and I'm hoping that he can bounce back to the form we saw in weeks 1 through 4. Sticking with the Bills, my high-flying running back is Zach Moss. Zach Moss had a great fantasy day, and it was probably on a bunch of benches or waiver wires. I picked up Zach Moss on Sunday morning. I had a flyer spot on my bench. I thought, hey, what if Singletary gets hurt, or what if Zach Moss establishes himself as the starter? I'll throw him on my bench and see what happens. He came through in a big way. He had 2 rushing touchdowns, over 80 yards, only on 14 carries. I think he got a couple targets thrown in there. So he looked really good. He had 20 fantasy points, but I will caution that he still split carries evenly with Devin Singletary, and Singletary was just as productive. It just so happened that Moss got the 2 rushing touchdowns. And this might be what you see going forward. Even if he and Singletary continue to split evenly, I think Moss is going to get the red zone carries, and therefore he has the touchdown upside that puts him into flex play on a weekly basis going forward. So both of these guys could be flex plays in good matchups. I think Singletary has a lower ceiling because Moss is going to get the red zone carries, so he's going to score more touchdowns. You will get sniped at the goal line sometimes by Josh Allen, which happened this past week, but I think Moss is establishing himself as a solid flex play, and if anything happens to Devin Singletary, Moss will be a very good high-end running back too for the rest of the season. My nose diving running back is Jonathan Taylor. Apparently, he got a little banged up, and that's why the Colts turned to Jordan Wilkins. But even before getting hurt, he was only 11 for 22. There's one particular play in the game that I can picture where Taylor had a huge hole to his left, but he straight up tunnel visioned, ran right into the back of his lineman, and tried to push his way for a couple extra yards instead of just bouncing a foot out to the left and running through this giant gap. So he turned a play that could have been a big yard chunk play into a 0 to 1 yard play. And the vision just does not look there. He hasn't looked good since taking over the starting role. And I think 11 for 22 stat line against a favorable Detroit matchup doesn't really bode well for how fantasy viable he's going to be the rest of the season for his rookie year. I'm not seeing any upside. I know people are going to be locked into playing him probably because he's a starting running back on an offense with a good offensive line, but man, Jordan Wilkins looked better. And if Taylor's hurt, he might end up missing time. I don't know how you can trust Taylor going forward. We'll see if he can improve at all, but it's not looking that promising for his rookie season. My high-flying wide receiver is Corey Davis. He was the wide receiver 4 on the week, and he's been great in the 5 games that he's been healthy. He has the same amount of targets on the year as A.J. Brown, and right now he currently has more yards. I think A.J. Brown has more touchdowns, so he's a little higher in fantasy points, but they've both played 5 games, and Corey Davis is, for all intents and purposes, just as productive as A.J. Brown. I'm not saying, though, that Davis is the number 1 on Tennessee, because I think A.J. Brown has more touchdown upside game to game. I think Brown has the higher probability of making a long play game to game. But I think Davis looks like a viable starter this season, and fantasy managers will need to forget the disappointing past few seasons for Corey Davis and pick him up and play him. Get him in your lineups. He is a good fantasy starting wide receiver. My nose diving wide receiver, which you knew this was coming, it's Amari Cooper. He started the season so good with Dak. Dak was on pace for historic yardage numbers. He was lighting up the scoreboard, mainly because he had to keep up because their defense was so bad. But the main benefactor of that was Amari Cooper. He was so good to start the season. And then, since then, the offense has looked kind of lost since they lost Dak. They've been stacking boxes against Zeke, like 8-man boxes against Zeke, because when Zeke's out there, what are you going to do? Let Ben DiNucci throw it? And Ben DiNucci is not good. I have serious doubts that Andy Dalton is a whole lot better. I think he will be better. And the one game with Andy Dalton, you saw Cooper be a serviceable wide receiver. But if Dalton's still out this week, you can't play Amari Cooper. If Ben DiNucci is starting again this week, you cannot play Amari Cooper. His fantasy stock obviously took a hit when Dak got hurt, but it may have been an even bigger hit than I initially thought. So I wouldn't be opposed to moving Cooper based on early season and his name value. So he performed really well early season. He has a good name. You could trade him, but if you hold on to him, you'll definitely need to adjust expectations to be a lot lower, I think. With Andy Dalton, it might be okay. He might be a low-end wide receiver 2. Maybe he can push his way up into a mid-tier wide receiver 2, but I don't think he's going to be a wide receiver 1 the rest of the season at all. My high-flying tight end is TJ Hockenson. He's been one of the most consistent tight ends on the year. He has either a touchdown or 50 yards or more in every game this season, when superstar tight ends like Mark Andrews and Darren Waller have multiple games with just 2 points. So Hawkinson's definitely a bright light in a bleak tight end landscape, and my models like him as a top 5 start the rest of the season. I would feel very good if you have TJ Hockenson on your roster. Maybe if you have Hockenson and Andrews or someone like that, maybe you drafted Hockenson as your tight end 2. Maybe you could move Andrews or Waller for a good running back or wide receiver piece and just keep rolling with Hockenson. I would not be opposed to that. I would like that move. Speaking of Mark Andrews, my nose diving tight end is in fact Mark Andrews. He's been bad mainly because Lamar has been bad. Lamar's passing has just not looked at all like it did last year in his MVP season. And the schedule continues to be rough for the next few weeks, culminating in another matchup with the Steelers, who they just played this past week. Andrews has touchdown upside every week, but he has no weeks over 60 yards, and any week that he hasn't scored a touchdown has been a complete bust. He's basically giving you a shot at a touchdown or nothing, just like any tight end streamer that you could pick up on the waivers, and that's not what you want from your top 3 drafted tight end. In my 10-team standard league, I actually benched Mark Andrews for Rob Gronkowski this past week. It ended up being a good move, and I'm probably rolling with Gronk again this week. We'll have to see how Gronk shakes out when Antonio Brown's active, when Chris Godwin comes back healthy. But as of now, I'm rolling with Gronk over Andrews. I know the Ravens' December schedule gets really light and really easy. So Andrews will probably come back and help you make a good playoff run. But right now, I don't have very much confidence in Andrews. Yes, he could catch 2 touchdowns in a game and be a good play, but he's not getting the targets, he's not getting the yards, and the offense just doesn't look near as efficient as it did last year. So we will keep going in this Tuesday episode and move into straight fire from the waiver wire. I'm just going to go through my favorite pickups at wide receiver, running back, and tight end, and give you options, maybe how much I would spend on them, and why I like them as my top option as opposed to somebody else who I will give some other options too. But so we will go into the running back first. My top target at running back this week is J.K. Dobbins. He and Gus Edwards were both good against a tough Steelers defense, but it was Dobbins who had a majority of the snap percentage, and it was Dobbins who went over 100 yards and averaged over 7 a carry. So with Ingram still injured or coming back from an injury, I think Baltimore will keep going to the 2 guys who have been doing so well for them, which makes Edwards and Dobbins both good pickups, I think. But I think Dobbins has more explosiveness, and with Edwards, you're relying more on touchdowns, which I don't like to bank on touchdowns. I like to bank on work, which Dobbins is getting more snaps, and I like to bank on explosiveness, which Dobbins has. So I'd be willing to spend about 10% of my fab on Dobbins, but don't overspend because it could become a 3-way split again if Ingram comes back. The Ravens aren't ready to hand the reins over to a rookie just yet, and then it becomes a 3-man backfield again. And if that's the case, Dobbins kind of loses all value again. He's on your waiver wire for a reason. It's because when all 3 of the running backs are in, none of them really have value. So other running backs, I mentioned Zach Moss. He's pretty widely available. I think he's a good pickup, but his upside is capped as long as he splits carries evenly with Singletary. So he's a solid pickup, and I think you can play him as a flex. The aforementioned Gus Edwards, he's widely available as well. He's viable as long as Ingram's out. Wayne Gallman, he looks pretty solid as the Giants starter. Even against the tough Tampa Bay defense last night, he looked pretty good. So if Devonta Freeman continues to miss, Wayne Gallman's a decent flex play flyer. And Cam Akers, he's also a very interesting pickup. Darrell Henderson left the game with an injury. And Cam Akers came in and actually looked pretty good. He had some ridiculous cuts that made these guys just, like, he broke these dudes' ankles, like 2 on the same play. So he clearly has some juice. Hopefully he's healthy now. And if Darrell Henderson misses time, I think Cam Akers could be a decent pickup. My top wide receiver to grab, I mentioned him earlier in the high flying section, is Corey Davis. And it's because he's been great when he's playing. He had 128 yards and a touchdown this past weekend. I think Ryan Tannehill is good enough to support him and A.J. Brown, so don't be worried about there not being enough passing work to go around. I think Corey Davis has shown that he's involved enough and that he can be productive enough where you can start him and A.J. Brown. I would spend about 8 to 10% of my fab to lock up a high upside flex play like Davis, who is past his bye, so you don't have to worry about any bye weeks coming up. He's past his bye, he's widely available, and you can pick him up and play him right away. Other wide receivers I would consider are Curtis Samuel. He had another game, and he had another rushing touchdown. His versatility makes him an interesting weekly flyer. He's definitely not going to be anything more than a flex play at all any point this season. And those rushing touchdown gadget type plays might go away once Christian McCaffrey comes back, which might be this week. So temper your expectations, but he's a decent pickup. Mike Williams showed up again in a big way for the Chargers. His streakiness makes him a really volatile play week to week. So you could play him in your flex and hope for one of those boom games, but you might get a week like last week where he had one catch for 4 yards. Marvin Jones, he could have another big week against Minnesota this week if Kenny Galladay is out. So Galladay left with an injury. I don't know the severity of this injury. I don't know if he is going to miss any more time. But Marvin Jones came in. He caught a touchdown. He was good. He'd be a decent play because Minnesota's defense isn't that good. And if he's number one for Matthew Stafford, I like him. And really desperate managers could look at Jacoby Myers from New England. He's probably the best wide receiver option on the team right now, with Julian Edelman being hurt and going to IR, N'Keal Harry being hurt. And even if N'Keal Harry's not hurt, he's probably better than N'Keal Harry. So, yeah, if you're really desperate, Jacoby Myers is there in deeper leagues for sure. My top tight end, surprise, surprise, I am going back to it, is Trey Burton. He's still only owned in 9% of leagues. He had another rushing touchdown, and while Nyheim Hines kind of stole the passing work this past week, I don't think that's going to be a weekly thing. This is only the second week in 8 that Nyheim Hines has been relevant. So I think Indy is going to keep using the tight end position. The tight end's going to get a lot of work because that's their system, and Phillip Rivers likes the tight end. And Trey Burton is their tight end. Just put a $0 bid on Burton and get a viable weekly tight end starter for your team. 9% owned, and he's done really well his past 4 games probably. Other tight ends to consider would be Eric Ebron. He had a decent week, and he could be a viable bye-week fill-in if you're desperate. He gets a decent amount of targets, and he's in a good offense. Outside of that, tight end is bleak. So if you're trying to replace George Kittle, my best recommendation is to get Trey Burton or try to trade. And finally, we will wrap up with the quarterback streamers, quarterbacks who I think have the best matchup. So streaming options at quarterback, I like Kirk Cousins. He's against Detroit. I know it didn't pan out last week, but it was kind of a product of the weather. It was super windy in Green Bay, so he only threw the ball like 16 times, but he was accurate on the ones he did throw. And with Dalvin Cook back, you saw Dalvin Cook take a short dump-off pass, like 50 yards for a touchdown or something like that. So you have that upside every week. And with Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson, you have 2 great wide receiving options, a running back that can turn short passes into long touchdowns. So he's a viable start. And actually, I like Kyle Allen. He gets to play against the Giants this week. He's been decent in all of his starts except for the one where he left with injury. So if you're in a deep league and you need a streamer, Kyle Allen can be a good option as well. Outside of that, I'm not seeing that many good options. Cam Newton, he might have been dropped. He's a decent option as well. He plays the Jets, but the Patriots passing game is just so bad. You're probably banking on Cam to rush in 2 touchdowns, which he might do against the Jets, but at the same time, we just saw Josh Allen struggle against the Jets 2 weeks ago, and Mahomes threw 5 touchdowns against them, but Cam's not throwing 5 touchdowns in any game because New England's not very good. So with that, we will wrap up the Tuesday episode. Be sure to check out the website for the Week 9 rankings. Those will be available on Thursday, probably Thursday afternoon, before kickoff. You can peruse those for any start-sit questions you have for the Thursday night game. And then those will be updated all the way until the kickoffs on Sunday afternoon. I have standard, half PPR, full PPR, flex rankings, defense rankings, whatever you need. It's all for free on the website, thefantasyfootballactuary.com. If you want to follow me on social media, my Twitter and Instagram handle are at theFFActuary. And I'm a lot more active on Twitter. I usually try to tweet out what's going on with the podcast. During the games, I might tweet out some interesting things before the games. I might share some injury. So be sure to follow me on social media. And we will wrap up this Tuesday episode. Enjoy your Tuesday. Enjoy Thursday Night Football. Hopefully, it's a good game against San Francisco and Green Bay. On paper, it looks better than the last couple matchups we've gotten. I know Jimmy Garoppolo is going to be out, so we're going to see Nick Mullins facing Aaron Rodgers. Hopefully, it's a good game. Hopefully, there's some good fantasy points scored and some good options like Brandon Ayuk, Aaron Jones. Hopefully, he's coming back, and we'll have a good time. I will see you on Saturday. And until next time, keep crunching those numbers.